Panelists, please take your seats on the front. Belen and Louis, take your seats. Yes, welcome to the second panel. My name is Shoaib Luasa, and I'll be chairing this session. Just a few things before we start, as you also take up your seats. There's a little bit of change in the program that you have. So we're going to first listen to two speakers on aspects about managing urban risk in African cities. And this will be the order. And then we'll turn to Latin America, and after that we will have a discussant. Adriana will step in to discuss the papers before we open the conversation or the discussion to the plenary. What we can also do very quickly after each presentation, I'll offer a chance, an opportunity for one burning question. Mostly clarity issues to clarify, and then we can proceed to the next presentation. So this is panel 2 on understanding and managing urban risk. So a lineup of very interesting presentations, one of which is really conceptual, the other is more of experiential, factual-based type of research. So we look forward to hearing from the presenters, and without much ado, I would like to call upon the first presenter, Emmanuel Osuteye, to take up the podium.
Thank you very much, Shoaib, and namaste, everyone. Or shall I say namaskara? Thank you for the opportunity, and thanks for coming to listen to our work. I would say that the work that we're presenting is forms part of our initial reflections from a much bigger piece of work that is ongoing. And I would start by sort of setting the scene, a bit of a background, a bit of an rationale and importance of the work that we are doing. And I'll hand over to my colleague, Brima, who will tell us a bit more about the approach, the process, the methods, and the key reflections that are beginning to emerge. As I said, this is sort of early days of our reflections, and so we are happy to share with you what is initially on our mind as we continue to sort of condense what we are learning from the work that is being done in Freetown. It's also part of a much larger research project. And if you see the bags that you are given, there's a lot more information about the project. So I'd like you to refer to them later. And also a paper tomorrow is very much linked to what we are saying. So the last paper on panel 5, that's a free advert for you, Barbara. So people should listen and pay attention to panel 5 as well. So moving on. What we're doing, why we are studying urban risk in Freetown, I mean, 3 amongst many other rationales, is that actually we need to kind of understand a more holistic approach to studying risk, and that a one-sided approach doesn't work. And we need to peel back the several layers that we need to understand the structural drivers to risk, how it forms, the regulatory frameworks, the gaps in planning, etc. Especially also the gaps in data. And so the work we are doing is contributing to data production. Secondly, second rationale amongst others is to understand that actually the formal planning systems are inadequate. And if we were to stick by them, we would have strict adherence, but it will still leave a large percentage of the population unaccounted for. A lot of people in Freetown live in informal settlements, and the formal planning systems don't adequately cover them. And also we need to think more about what are the innovative alternate approaches after this preamble that formal planning systems are inadequate and are not really covering the bulk of the city. So this is Freetown. This is Sierra Leone, actually, and that's Freetown, that small tip there. It's a city of about 1.2 million people, very fast growing. It's the capital of the country on the West African coast. What we learned about risk in Freetown is that risk is accumulating, like many other urban centers, and the accumulation is producing a certain type of inequality, especially in informal settlements. If you look at how the city's growth is, the patterns of growth, the patterns of investment, the widespread nature of socioeconomic conditions that are not fair and even, etc. Challenges with disaster risk management and reduction and implementation, etc., leaves portions of the city actually suffering more than others. And largely these are concentrated in informal settlements. So I think that one of the biggest lessons of observations is that the patterns in which the city is being developed, the investments in city growth, the investments in buildings and infrastructure and etc., are allowing for a rapid expansion and increase in informality and a very unequal burden that these informal settlements are bearing. On that note, I'd like to just quickly draw your attention to two of these typologies. And that in Freetown, most of the informal settlements fall under two typologies in terms of settlement types. Either they're living in the hillsides, which was the available extra land after the planned city for about 300,000 people, is a rapid expansion into the hills, deforestation, etc. But you can see that it's not just expansion into the hills that is a problem. It is because of its unplanned nature, it's because of its informal nature, the adoption of methods of construction that are very local and not very thorough. They lead to a lot of structural collapses, etc. And also along the coast is this highly dense production of settlements that also the marginal lands that are available. Many recent settlers in the city cannot afford to live inside the city where housing could have been better. So they settle along the coast. One significant observation is the traditional method of land banking and the production of spaces or a substrate for construction, and in itself is very precarious. So these two typologies are where most informal settlements occur. And it's also interesting to note that the current planning systems do not cover the current state of risk or urban risk, because risk occurs across the spectrum. The formal approach to urban planning is not sufficient. It's not working because of a number of factors, including the institutional weaknesses and fragilities in the systems. And also, this status quo allows us to increasingly reflect, especially in Freetown, for the need for alternative measures and alternative approaches, mainly community-based. So community-based methods in Freetown offer a breath of fresh air, a case of promise, a new lease of thinking of how risk can be governed and how risk can be managed. And it's well suited for the context because of the lack of data, etc. It stimulates local debate and priority for action planning and priority setting, draws on local knowledges, etc. And I think that I'll hand over to Brima now to explain how the work in Freetown is being organized and what we can learn.
Okay, starting from it, I mean, Freetown definitely face quite a good number of other challenges, ranging from spatial inequalities, lack of access to services, as well as even increase in vulnerability and resilience within those set of informal settlements. So as part of our work, we are basically using a number of other approaches and tools, and those approaches and tools have been much more reflective of some of the key, what's called integrative, iterative, as well as multidisciplinary approach towards our work, and we'll be able to also do some few community-led data collection exercise that basically builds on some of the key local network, as well as the Federation of Urban and Rural Poor. And through our work in terms of co-producing knowledge, they'll be able to actually involve in terms of shaping the different set of questions that we ask. I mean, reflecting on those questions, and also be involved in terms of collecting and producing some of the key data. Then also, those actors also act as champions in terms of the kind of research impact that we've also been doing. As part of the new projects, definitely we are doing what we call perspective, research methodologies, basically in terms of action planning. They are basically involved in terms of what statement timeline, actually measuring its trajectories of urban changes within those set of environments. They've also been able to look at transit work. Some of the key perspective mapping exercise has also been done. Then also using some of the key conventional qualitative and quantitative data, basically looking at semi-structured interviews. Also looking at surveys. These are part of the key set of methodologies that we've been using, whilst also ensuring that indeed they are able to actually identify some of the key risk events within those communities and understanding of those risks and what set of specific actions to be able to actually do. So on the basis of that, for us to actually ensure that indeed there is some collective actions or concrete step in terms of actually addressing disaster risk or resilient issues. We'll be able to actually organize at two different levels. Organize and sustained what's called community settlement level actions, which often been established what's called community learning platforms. Then at city level, we have the city learning platform. So at least those set of institutional spaces have definitely been provided for community residents as well as even the city level actors to sit within the common platform or space to actually be able to identify some of these different urban development challenges or related to risk issues and see possibly what set of concrete actions they can be able to actually take, whilst also, producing those actions and also responding to those different actions as the case may be. So on the basis of that, the current so on the basis of that, based on what is now emerging from our study, is that indeed risk governance is more or less at community level is based on an integrative approach in terms of resilient building, and we have seen quite a good number of other actors, basically ranging from federation, the SLOC itself, the community leaders, and other things. These communities themselves are able to actually evolve, develop what's called local disaster management network, what we call community-based disaster management networks. And through some of the other actions that we'll be able to do, the community themselves are able to actually do what we call strategic action planning based on some few risk activities, and they're able to actually pull resources together in building the resilience of those different communities in which they are often being affected. And creating that new space, we actually be able to actually have what's called participation and democratic involvement in terms of major decision-making process. And these are definitely some of the key communities that are able to have development committees. Those development committees are able to actually identify risk events and be able to pull resources together to actually build the resilience of those areas. And through the city learning as well as community learning platform, we have had a kind of diversity of actors. Basically taking into account some of those either local, authority, disabled, youth, and men's group actually sitting within a common platform, identify their own actions and see possibly what could also be done. And through the CAP process as well, the community itself are able to identify some of the key resilience building projects, and those resilience building projects are also being undertaken by a number of other agencies on the ground. And the next slide. And this is a story that developed through the actions that we'll be able to do, bringing all of those different actors in kind of platform. We're able to build their capacity, involving some planning and concrete actions. And over time, this is now gradually been moving in terms of expanding those partnerships between the different sort of actors and actions, concrete actions that are emerging from those deliberations. Definitely, it's been translating the research into practical actions that are often leading to urban equality. So on the personal.
I think, in conclusion, these are pictures of the spaces that have been created. The community level platform, and also the attempt to integrate into city level discussions. For example, with an initiative in the Office of the Mayor called the Transform Freetown Agenda, just to show that actually the work that is being done is also trying to link back into policy spaces and decision-making spaces across the city. But in conclusion, we also wanted to reflect. That's one of the things we are doing in the conference, to think about how these reflections, these lessons, and the work that we are doing have a bearing on our understanding about urban equality, or how to advance the cities to be more equal. And reflecting on what the NO program calls its placeholder definitions. We can see that the work in Freetown, starting at the bottom with the parity of political participation, is opening up more spaces for political participation. There is an increased reciprocal recognition, particularly with the Office of the Mayor or at the level of the city governance, some amount of recognition there. So within these two arms of our exploration and understanding of urban equality, we can see that the work of the constellation of different actors involved in urban planning and interventions in the city is enabling these two to work. The third, where the arm of equitable distribution needs to be interrogated a bit further, and we'll talk a bit more as a team and reflect a bit more on our findings. And I think we would like to end here on that note. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. you very much, Emmanuel and Brahima, for that very insightful presentation on co-production in Freetown. I just want to give a chance to only one very quick question, if there is, before we move on. Yes.
Is there openness within the city administration to take into account the work that's being done here?
Yeah, at the city level, definitely due to our work, there have been kind of what you call a change in mindset of the different set of actors and authority. And some of the, initially there was no sort of recognition in terms of the data that even the community residents often collect. But today, in terms of also reflecting even in terms of the Transfer Freetown framework, some of the data collected by the Federation and other community residents have definitely been recognized. And some of those information would also find themselves within the medium-term national development plan in terms of actually measuring the kind of formal and informal settlement within the Freetown municipality. And through building resilience process, for initially when the disaster management network, disaster management framework was developed by city, by government, there was so much recognition in terms of what we call the community-based disaster management committees at that time. But over time, due to the constant constellation in terms of community of practice, based on the current evolving trend, there had now been a recognition of those community-based disaster management network. They're serving as an entry point in terms of any kind of intervention often done by either agencies, government, or that set of actors. So there's now some semblance of engagement with those set of community residents actually working on building resilience of those communities.
30 seconds to say that these are outcomes that Brahima is saying, that we can see outcomes of increased recognition of city actors and the local government. But also to mention that the local government has been involved in the research itself. So the actors within the Freetown City Council, the Mayor's Office, and several layers of local decision making have been involved within the actual research, conceptualization, design, participation. They are part of the team, and so they've not been alienated or left to dissemination stages only, where there can be a disconnect. And that, I think, is a very important tactic that the Sierra Leone Urban Research Center has adopted and is implementing across all its projects, that actual decision makers are part of the research team, a very collaborative, co-produced effort, different knowledge sources as well. And so I think that has been very key to why these outcomes are emerging.
Yeah, thank you very much for that response, because it is helping, and you will bridge it to the discussion moment when you possibly even give further unpacking of the co-production and the governance and the real action and the translation of that. And I like the use of outcomes, so you may think about progress markers instead of impact in that case. I would like us to move on to the next presentation by Festo and team and Emmanuel. And this presentation is on getting action on disaster risk co-production of reduction in informal settlements in Dar es Salaam. Festo and team.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. We are very grateful for this opportunity to share with you some piece of work that we are doing in Tanzania. And about a small background about our organization is called Center for Community Initiatives, that was established in 2004 with a vision of helping urban poor communities to develop their quality of life through sustainable solutions. And our organization works with the Federation of the Urban Poor in many, many cities of Tanzania. We have about 8 cities where CCI is implementing. Next. The kind of work that we want to present to you, it's about the research that we had conducted in order to identify the risk. We call them everyday risk within the communities. And why we did that, we realized that in most cases, in Tanzania and many developing countries, the governments have been spending quite a lot of time on disaster management. They wait for the disaster to happen And that's where they really pump a lot of resources on disaster issues. But we realized that by working with the community, we can really be able to identify risk, sort of a risk reduction. By identifying this risk, it means we can be able to reduce the much, much bigger disaster which might happen. And we have some research questions that we had developed, which one was to assess the day-to-day environmental risk within the community. And also, we wanted also to identify the burden rising from this risk so that they can make informed planning decisions. And we also developed methods of working collaborative between communities and the other local decision making. And my colleague here will be able to develop, to explain to you the methodology that we use and some of the key initial findings that we realized. And after that, I will be able to reflect on the urban equality research that we have been working together. Welcome.
Okay, thank you, Tim, for the introduction. The methodology that we applied, first we did the study in different settlements, but today I'm going to share two settlements. One is called Bondelampunga settlement, which is located in Kinondoni municipalities, and it had a population of 17,000 people who are living in that settlement. And another settlement is called Tamban settlement, which also is in Ilala municipalities, and has a population of 13,000 populations that are living in the settlement. The methodology that we applied, it's called action at the front line. It's the methodology that aims of capturing this day-to-day risk that a community experiencing in their communities or in their lives. And it's through conversations with the respondents. And the team that engaged in the data corrections is, as we said, it's a co-production of this risk community experiencing. It had people from communities, local communities from this settlement that we conducted. We had some government officials, we had some graduates from universities, and we had some people from civil society in CCI, this organization that was leading the activity. The methodology itself, it aims at capturing threats or risk that community are experiencing, also the impact that are caused by those risks, and what has the community have been doing or thinking should be done as an actions to reduce, and what are the barriers that communities have been experiencing or they see for those actions that they are proposing will won't work. Okay, so we started with training those teams, communities, people from universities, and people from the government. All together we sat down to find first the proper languages to use when we are doing the research of identifying those risks. And why? Because everyone has his definitions on risk and disaster. So we had also to sit down and agree on what words we should use when we're talking about risk. So we had people from university, they had their own definitions. We had people from the community, they had their own definitions. We had some experts who also have their own definitions. So we had like 3 days training, first of all, to have one language to use when we are going back to collect the data. This is the team during the data collection. So we did 200, in these two settlements, 200 household questionnaires, which was done through conversation with those who were responding. But also we did some FGDs with some specific groups, for example, elderly and some children. Sorry, it's not moving. Okay, so the initial finding that we corrected, starting with the threats or risk for these two settlements. Okay, these are in one of the settlements. One big issue that we came up was crime and other risks, as you can see. And from this study that we found, which is very interesting, the risks that communities are identifying or giving out, they are quite different from what the government and other disaster experts are defining as a risk in the communities. And following slide is showing some of the risks that were in another settlements, but I would like to see some impacts that people were facing due to those risks, and I wanted to see some actions that community proposed. So I would like to see, for example, on the actions, you can see there is a very difference between what the government proposing as actions to reduce those risks or disasters. They are quite different from what communities are proposing. For the communities, they are very small interventions which are affordable in one way and feasible in other ways. For example, on the issue of flooding, the community have identified that the only action that they can do is to clean up the drainages so that when it rains, water can pass through easily and not leading the flooding. But if it could be the government's proposed action, it would be like expanding drainage, which sometimes is not feasible and sometimes is high cost. Community or government itself can't afford to do those kind of interventions. And there was some, I don't know if I missed this one slide for barriers, but there were some barriers that communities also identified that may hinder those actions to be achieved. But the conclusion that I can make on the findings is one, that the everyday risks that the community are giving out with this methodology, it gives the real voice of the community on what they're experiencing in their daily lives. But also, it's the issue of the spectrum. We found that it's a wide range of risks that's identified by the community compared to what the government has in their database. For example, in the communities, the government can't talk about the issue of crime. They will only focus on the flooding or maybe if bigger disaster happen, for example, earthquake. But with the communities, those small issues that has impact on their daily lives, they'll mention it in the findings. So maybe let me take back to it.
Yeah, so finally, what are we learning about the urban equality on these matters of urban risk? As my colleague has explained that normally the government normally thinks about the bigger disaster issues, but we have demonstrated that by working together in a co-production way between the community, the academia, the civil society, and the local government working together, we can be able to identify a number of risk issues which can be reduced in one way or another. So we have about 3 points that we want to draw in the conclusion. What to do, these findings says about the distribution of access to income and service to all citizens is that normally resources allocation for the disaster issues, as what I said, they normally happen when a disaster has been hit for the bigger impact. But what we are saying, by recognizing the smaller risk, the day-to-day risk, the government can distribute resources to all those other risks, and which ensures that everybody within the community and everybody within the society is also benefiting, hence ensuring equality within the neighborhood. The second point is about what do the findings say about recognition of different social identities and the environment in every way. This piece of work has been able to recognize other components within the community which has a room for engaging all the citizens. We realize that within the neighborhood we have a component called World Development Committee. And this is a committee which connects between the community and the ward level. And that's where the budget allocation is normally being set. So we ensure that by engaging everybody, all these functional committees can be able to be implemented and everybody can be involved. And the last point is about active engagement of all citizens. We realize that there is a need for ensuring that everybody within the community is being engaged. And through this process, we as an NGO working with the community, we had been given an opportunity to sit on the disaster committee at the district level. So we are part of that committee. And we want to use that opportunity to influence changes in the thinking within the government about disaster management, and also considers issues on risk reduction, because sometimes disaster are being given much more priority than risk reduction. So this is a last component that we want to share with you, that are enhancing urban equality within our cities. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Team Manifesto, for that presentation. Again, as we did last time, if there's a very quick one question that will help us to bridge the discussions, is there are 4 presentations. Seems like Dar es Salaam co-production and engagement is very clear. Okay, the 2 presentations have mainly looked at Dar es Salaam and Freetown. You can think of that as Africa-focused research and the emerging preliminary findings of everyday risk. There are a few things to connect, maybe a few dots to connect. I think when it comes to accumulated risk, that the first presentation talked about, and then everyday risk. Some nodes to connect there, I think it's very important, and then engagement as well. So it seems, it's important to take note of how the importance of people that are affected by urban risk in terms of managing that risk. I would like us now to move on to the next 2 presentations, which are Latin American focused, and we will start with Alan Lavelle. I'm curious, as just as anybody else, to hear about the front and backline issues and priorities on resilience and risk.
Thank you very much, and thank you all for being here. What I'm going to try and do in a short time of 15 minutes, which is like eighth the time in universities, it just doesn't exist really, is to set a prelude or a scene set for what would be the second stage of work we're doing in Latin America in 3 countries, in 3 major metropolitan areas of Barranquilla in Colombia, Lima in Peru, and San Jose in Costa Rica, where what the overall objective is basically to understand how risk is constructed, to understand how, and this is where the front line, back line comes in, how communities as such understand that risk, deal with it, construct imaginaries around it, and how government or other interveners consider disaster risk within communities. And then to try, looking at past historical experience with intervention, to trace new ways of dealing with what is essentially disaster risk within a resilience framework, but which can consider, and this has been introduced very well by the previous speakers, other aspects of risk in cities, which we denote as everyday risk or disaster risk associated with small and medium scale events as opposed to major extreme events in cities. And I'm going to deal with the second phase just as a conceptual and methodological introduction, recognizing that the first stage of our work done over the last year was an attempt to spatially map disaster risk in the city, particularly associated with hydrometeorological events, and to cross that over statistically with mapping techniques, with measures of urban inequality, poverty, or lack of prosperity, if we wish. And so in some cities we had access to work on Gini coefficients, income distribution between different areas of a city, income levels in medium and average terms, etc. In others we didn't. In some we had access to information on disease, on insecurity through public health and public security issues, etc. So that was the first stage, which basically was trying to set up the notion, but we can identify differences within cities. And here's as a starting point we used in this, that all that seems to be the same is in fact very different. And what I mean by that is that what seems to be the same from a hazard perspective when looked at from a social construction perspective, is completely different. So there is no way of having a homogeneous, one-sided approach to dealing with disaster risk in cities. You do need the co-production process, you need the participatory analysis, you need the relationship between government and communities. So basically, what I want to do is to forget the first year's work, which was a background allowing us to select communities within cities with which to work in the future, and just to lay out some of the major conceptual aspects that will guide the way we deal with communities in terms of the techniques we use to co-produce information. The first one is obviously the resilience as such, and I don't want to go too far into that. It's a very debatable thing, and very debatable in Latin America, resilience. Few people understand it, but everybody uses it. Basically, what I'm going to say about it is that we're going to take it as being a reflection of work done with an advanced development concept of disaster risk management. I say that with the emphasis on an advanced development-based approach to disaster risk management and climate change adaptation. And but it also merges in with lifestyle and livelihood planning to improve the state of the existence of communities in cities. I don't want to go any further because it's far more complex, but what we are going to try and do is to construct a type of risk-free, income-based resilience index that we're starting to work on the development of, and that I could discuss with people outside of the context of these 15 minutes. So what are the two major things that come to us? And one thing which is interesting about these, and I'll say this deliberately, and it also reflects why the statistics show we have not reduced risk in the world, and that disasters are leading to increasing damage over time as opposed to reduced damage, is the fact that most of what I'm going to be talking about was said 40 years ago. And I say that deliberately. So the first aspect is around what we now call the social construction of risk, which is based on vulnerability paradigms as an understanding of risk, which date back to Ben Wisner's work in the 1970s at Bradford, but was taken up by Ken Hewitt in a very, probably the best piece of literature on the topic, which most people should read, called Ideas of Calamity in a Technocratic Age in 1983, where what he said was that disasters are not abrupt interruptions of everyday life. They are rather the continuity of everyday life. And that builds us into what the previous speakers were saying, that disasters are in fact reflections of ongoing social processes which, when there is the occurrence of an event, are actualized and turn into disaster loss and impacts. And so this very phrase, accompanied by the idea that risk cannot be discretely considered in separate parts. For instance, we talk about disaster risk, we talk about health risk, we talk about financial risk. The recognition is nowadays that these are intimately related in causal patterns. Consequently, communities live under a very complex issue of risk, which can't be reduced to disaster risk or to others. And this brings us to the one conclusion of the type of approach we have to have in doing this. That is to have a holistic approach to risk in the framework of local or community development. And here we come to a very strange conclusion, which is guiding some of our work. There is a perverse relationship here. You know, some time ago, Ian Burton, Robert Cates in geography, actually talked about the way that risk was advantage and disadvantage. There was a continuum. Most hazard-prone zones in the world offer advantage and disadvantage in different time periods. So living on the sides of slopes of volcanoes, the sides of rivers, the sides of lakes offers great advantage at times and offers destruction, death, etc. at other times. And so communities, and this Andrew Mastery said in '88 in his book for Oxfam, that risk within communities is a play-off, a trade-off between different risks in different time periods. So our only way of really getting through to the understanding of risk is through a holistic approach, whereby communities, and we understand that communities in fact find advantage in living in hazard-prone regions. It's a perverse statement, but it is in fact true. When you don't have money to accede to the regular, safe market, then you're obliged to locate in hazard-prone zones. But because of that, you become a political agent and you negotiate with government and you get services, water, electricity, etc. And then when there's disaster, you get roofs and you get food, etc. That's a perverse thing to say, but in fact, that's the way it works. In fact, in many communities where you have to trade things off. So our approach will be to go in through this vision of holistic risk and causal and difficult causal. The second one, which is very much related in the last 3 minutes, I think, and which also comes from the continuity of a social construction approach, is that we have to deal with governments and external actors still operating in what we call an exogenous interpretation of disaster as opposed to an endogenous interpretation. What do I mean by this? That natural disasters, disaster impacts are deaths. No, disaster impacts aren't deaths. That is the disaster. That's the impact of a hazard on a vulnerable society. But we use these things as if disaster was the result of an external agent impacting on innocent communities, instead of seeing risk as built up within the communities themselves. And our postulate is that most governments, despite the fact that they have a discourse which goes other ways, in fact are operating according to an exogenous interpretation. That is, events cause disasters as opposed to society causing disasters. So they stay within a corrective risk management framework and a reactive risk management framework and can't get into the deep causal processes which is required for prospective planning. So I'll finish there, and I think I still got 2 minutes. Well, I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alan, for that very thoughtful, conceptual and philosophical presentation about risk and the construction of risk. A quick question, if there is any. Okay. We will now move on to Belen and Louis, who will be speaking about rendering visible and multi-scalarity of everyday risk, a continuation of perhaps what was also presented by Dar es Salaam and some of the aspects that Alan has touched on. So, Belen, the floor is yours.
Morning. Well, our presentation will try to show our work in two ways. The first of all is the construction of some framework to confront the problem of inequality in Lima, and the second one is some actions around this. Well, we see a high correlation between vulnerability and risk exposure and the experience of everyday urban inequalities. The higher the risk for certain communities, the higher the level of exposure to urban inequality. In this context, how to approach co-production processes that do not fall into assistantialism and allow urban transformation that challenge inequalities. Yes. Lima, like most cities with a colonial past, has an unequal origin in this DNA, in political, social, economic, and spatial terms, expressed in its division in the city of Spaniards and the city of Indians. This regime did not change during the Republic, with a strong separation between the Andean and Amazonian regions and the Creole population that inhabited cities in the coast. This is evident in Lima, especially since the 1930s, when a migratory wave from the Andes began occupying the periphery, forming the first slums. The history of Peru is marked by an alternation between dictatorial regimes and democratic periods, which continued violent practices from the colony in the implementation of power and order. While the dictatorship supported the city of slums, the democratically elected leaders sought to insert modern principles in the formal city. Hence, during the 20th century, the division of the city of Spaniard and the city of Indian became that of a formal city and the informal city. As a consequence of these strong inequalities, a period of political violence began in the 1980s, leading to an economic and social crisis weakening the institutions and bringing about corruption and terrorism, which lasted until the year 2000. This period consolidated this dual, fragmented, and unequal city from which symbolic spaces emerged, expressing it in all its violence. Inequality in Lima is the product of violent process of different characters, a cultural of domination, structural conditions, and inequality itself that began in the 15th century and evolved over time. This violence and the categories analogous to it designed by Johann Galtung allows us to reflect on the relationship between inequality, violence, and city, proposing the following triangle to analyze urban inequalities through three interconnected lenses. First, tangible or direct urban inequality, which can be perceived directly through the difference in the built environment and territorial occupation. Secondly, structural urban inequality, which reproduce and normalize inequality through the policy and law that govern the city and how citizen action towards city maker interact and are shaped by current governance systems. Finally, cultural or symbolic urban inequality, which is expressed in social behavior and dynamics and in language and in discourse built by citizens and the state.
We are currently building relationships between these three dimensions at different scales of the urban, working with our partners and public institutions in the co-production of alternative paths towards challenging inequality. It is important to understand how inequality is currently measured and represented by policymakers who generally use home for social indicators or housing for physical indicators as a unit of analysis. This delineates a clear duality of center-periphery. However, this analysis is not complemented with other dimensions of the urban, so daily experiences of women and men, their differentiated access to quality public spaces, convenient public transport and services, and fair and equitable working conditions are completely omitted. Under this logic, existing public policies work towards poverty reduction from a top-down perspective without co-production and without transforming the structural dynamics that generate poverty, risk exposure, and inequality. For instance, granting land titles without other initiatives that tackle other dimensions of the urban limits the possibility of breaking traps that reinforce poverty, sustaining a system that generates and reinforces inequality. Lima grew tenfold in less than a century, predominantly by land occupations in which thousands of families got together to access plots provided by the state and which included designated areas for roads and urban services, the self-built city. Those massive land occupations of the 60s, 70s, and 80s are now Lima's emerging middle class. Land occupation has continued in more vulnerable soil following its discriminated provision of land titles by the state with no vision for the provision of infrastructure and services. A section cut through peripheral neighborhoods shows this atomization of both the production of urban space and of social mobilization, with social groups composed by a lower number of families that occupy smaller areas that, although next to each other, are not connected physically nor socially. Co-production of the city becomes harder to achieve, limiting itself to small neighborhood units. This map shows predominant socioeconomic levels and shows a great diversity of power within these peripheral districts, shedding light on the differentiated access to development opportunities depending on where and when citizens occupied land. Another type of fragmentation is that of urban governance. Metropolitan Lima is currently composed of 50 districts that do not always work together and with a very unequal distribution of budget, which is assigned according to the contribution of taxpayers within each district. Thus, the most affluent district has 20 times more budget per capita than the poorest one. Co-production and collaboration, once again, is challenged. Limited budget and planning capacity result in ultra-localized, not articulated, and short-term investment toward disaster risk management, mainly for stairs and contention walls, which are not connected to each other or to broader urban systems. Urban inequality is also manifested in the more symbolic aspects of the urban, like the quality of the spaces we occupy daily. In a city that never rains, green means wealth. The variety and quality of urban furniture has a symbolic component that depends exclusively on architectural decisions, its location, the procedure which the project is assigned, the project's program, and its cost. The same applies to disaster risk reduction infrastructure. It can either add or reduce value to the land, as well as propel a feeling of belonging and appropriation according to its symbolic quality and significance. how to explore this complexity and how to render visible these daily experiences of inequality throughout the metropolis towards truly collaborative process. We propose to analyze a representative section that crosses the city through districts of upper, middle, and lower strata. This methodology allows us to understand the main dynamics and problems of Lima through an exhaustive study of a fragment that represents inequality in all its diversity, thereby avoiding the concentration of the analysis in less favored areas of the city, understanding that this emphasis will generate an analysis of poverty but not inequality. These explorations were constructed with students of architecture, promoting a self-recognition of themselves as citizens that also experience inequalities in their daily lives. This section also propels the exploration of alternative forms of representation using cartographic tools and other media, recognizing their necessarily political and subjective nature capable of highlighting or rendering invisible characteristics of reality. For example, we see in this graphic not only the different mobility types, but also a difference in the availability of transport options. While some citizens have over 7 different types of transport, other areas of the city can only be reached by walking. I'll go through this really quickly. In this section shows how many liters per capita are consumed per district, adding a new layer of inequality, which becomes particularly pertinent in an arid city. It's not a matter of providing better water provision, but also of using water much more efficiently, a collaborative process which we are currently exploring with an NGO, Foro Ciudades para la Vida. The section allows a more detailed understanding of certain sectors of the metropolis while articulating them with broader temporal and territorial scales. Working with our partner NGOs, SIDAP and SENCA, we have developed a detailed analysis of the main structural drivers of everyday inequalities as experienced by the residents of Barrios Altos in the historic center and José Carlos Mariátegui in the peripheries. The analysis of José Carlos Mariátegui has allowed us to construct a timeline leading to increasing fragmentation traps in the city governance, while in Barrios Altos, a depiction of incremental conflict between residential areas and commerce of a metropolitan scale. The next step contemplated, and for which these actions serve as a basis, is to initiate applied research promoting practice and experimentation through collaborative, interdisciplinary, and interinstitutional urban design, presenting these actions as processes that seek to generate concrete urban transformations with the NGOs, municipalities, and the ministry itself, aiming to break current technocratic and ultra-localized approaches to disaster risk reduction, and thus transforming the relationship between the three dimensions of inequality. In this way, No Lima seeks to go beyond the understanding and visibility of inequality, promoting the generation of skills and knowledge to challenge it through collaborative urban design, seeking to challenge it at multiple scales. We have planned a series of activities towards this goal to be co-produced with a diversity of partners and actors, rendering visible already existing knowledge and experiences of inequality in Lima with our partner NGOs, articulating them to broader global discussions and opening up a platform in which the processes of co-design and collective decision-making with municipalities and community leaders is emphasized. Time up, and yeah, this is a more detailed table of all our activities. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Loie and Belen, for that very good presentation about Lima and the biopsy of the cross-city neighborhoods in terms of inequality. A very quick question, if there is any one question. Okay, so we saved a bit of time. We have an additional discussant. We're going to have two discussants. The first will be Adriana, and then followed by Joseph. So Adriana, 5 minutes. Yeah.
Okay. Sounds like a lot of a lot of inputs. Well, thanks a lot to 5 minutes. Yeah, you want? Yeah. Thanks a lot to all the presenters. Wonderful reflections that I think that take us well beyond the word of risk. So quite difficult to pick what. Someone is calling. Cassidy. Okay. Shall we have Cassidy first? No? No? Okay. Okay. I was just thinking, okay, sorry, okay, that's fine. So I was saying, difficult to pick. I thought there were so many interesting contributions, again, that take the discussion on equal cities beyond the issue of risk. But I'm just going to pick on 3 things of what I think we were talking about across all presentations. The first thing, I suppose has to do with something that I thought came very clearly in all the presentations, which was to put forward what is the value of critically looking again at questions of risks, and what do they tell us, some of things being new, some things being old, but things that we need to remind ourselves of, about how is that inequality continues shaping cities. And I think that in that sense, the genealogy that Alan offered was very useful, in the sense that for many of you, many of you might be thinking, but actually this is a debate that we had back in the 70s, when we firmly seem to have discovered that disasters were not, produced by nature or by God, but very much produced by society. There was nothing natural about disasters and so on. So that thinking about denaturalizing disasters was very, very strong in the 70s, and very, very strong thanks to people like Alan here, and many more in what was called La Red, that help us to think about cities in a different way. Somehow, and it's important to think about this, we seem to have lost track of that very important footprint that was already helping us to think about the fact, for instance, again, that there was nothing random, in the sense that, informal settlements are more at risk than any other areas in the city, and informal settlers are also at risk, because urbanization is a structural condition of informal urbanization. So all those things were very, very firmly on the agenda on the 70s, and somehow we lost them along the way, and we need to think why. Now, we talk again about risk very predominantly then in the 90s and 2000s, but with quite a different exogenous agenda. And what brings risk back into the agenda, particularly in relation to cities, has to do again with climate change, the urgency that we need to act. We have very little time. Many things have to happen in the name of risk. And what we see here is again a new form of misalignment between the governance of risk, how we talk about risk, and the knowledge that we produce on risk. And I think that something really interesting that everybody was putting forward was, how do we work around that new misalignment that produces very, very important challenges, in the sense that we might be feeding or challenging, for instance, agendas that might be, again, very oppressive, very repressive, and so on, even very acritical in many ways. So I thought that, again, lots of interesting things as to what the colleagues here were telling us. How do you do that? How do you reconnect that alignment? So issues, for instance, around the connection between the who and where were omnipresent. And this is very important. It's not only the question of who is at risk, but where are you at risk? And as the colleagues from Lima and many others were highlighting, the question of when as well. How long you have been in the city and where you have been and so on counts and matters as much as who you are. Not only in terms of the distribution of risk, what is going to be the burden that you receive, but also very much in terms of the recognition or misrecognition that you might be subjected to. I think that there was a question on, perhaps on the intention, again, a very common thing, on the intention of saying, okay, perhaps knowledge co-production around questions of risk and resilience building can be a sort of leveling field, a way of tackling issues of misrecognition and parity of participation and so on. And I think that perhaps, something important that we need to think as researchers or as people that work from different perspectives is how much, what is the distance, or what is the critical space between the intention of knowledge co-production and the actual impact of knowledge co-production. In many cases, I think that we might be repackaging, in a way, power relations, power relations in knowledge production, and renaming them with the best intention and knowledge co-production. And we need to keep on critically pushing ourselves on that. I'm saying this, for instance, in the sense that what we are calling the community or the community strategies and so on might be populated by relations or trade-off or practices that are completely different for those that are tenants and those that, I don't know, are landlords or landladies, even if they don't have a title. And we are not excavating enough those differences, and we are not excavating enough who travels into the action that knowledge produces. and that who doesn't travel. So again, this is not to criticize the effort, but to think, can we keep on pushing? And I finish with a final point, which is the issue of a sort of normative framing around all this. There is also another risk, which is, of course, I mean, we tend to celebrate the fact and the idea that somehow resilience seems to have places, and the idea of thinking about resilient cities seems to place us in a better note, in the sense that, well, it seems to be more positive to build resilience than to deal or manage with disasters or risk. However, we do need to remember and remind ourselves constantly that building resilience and managing risk is not the same as building just cities. And we need to measure what is the difference, what are we living. So in the same way that I was saying before, we need to be very mindful of who is being left behind, even in our best efforts. We also have to be very mindful of what is being left outside in our very good efforts of capturing the conditions of urbanization in risk. I stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very, very, very much for that very wonderful discussion and the overview on the 3 points that you summarize about all the presentations. Joseph? Okay, wonderful.
Let me join you, Shop, to thank the different presenters. I think I was very much thrilled, and more especially, I think my comments draw from the commonalities that actually are being reflected in the different presentations. And this is the fact that in most of the cities that the presentations have been made on, generally from the global south, seems to be experiencing similar trajectories in terms of growth, both in spatial and demographic terms. But at the same time, I think what was expressed more vividly is the lack of capacity of government, especially in terms of addressing these issues. It might be capacity in terms of the technical skills, but also in terms of the resources. And therefore, for that particular reason, in some of the cities, the government tend to focus on only selected places in terms of their decisions or interventions, thereby limiting their scope of reach to other areas. And in some of these cities, more especially, it's so much in the informal settlements. And what is clear also is the fact that in most of these places, hazards, shocks, and stresses seem to be really undoing a lot of progress that is being taking place, especially in the realm of development. And so therefore, it is really reversing efforts at poverty reduction, but also in terms of urban development. And a lot of these are being triggered by development that has been taking place over the years, but also the lack of it in some of the places. And so some of these developments may have taken place before or are even ongoing. And so therefore, they are really triggering either new forms of risk, or they are also leading to the frequency as well as the intensity of these risks in those particular places where they are. But generally, what seems to be missing is that the interconnections as well as the complexity of these risks seem to be least understood by the city governments that have responsibility for taking care of it. But at the same time, even when they are understood, they seem to not to be giving attention to it. And so therefore, the lack of recognition of this is really leading to a lot of non-actions, especially by the state authorities. And so therefore, the concern most often has been to focus more on episodic or more disasters that seems to be large scale, rather than the everyday disasters that really underlie some of the inequalities that exist in some of these particular places. And more often, the inaction has led to the emergence of community-led actions. And so therefore, the communities seem to be actually filling this void, but their role seems to be a lot unnoticed, and they don't seem to be recognized so much. But yet, I think what has come out clearly is the fact that community residents are playing very major roles, and so therefore their roles need to be really recognized if we have to make disaster risk reduction a major priority for this government. And as a result of that, it's so much about what kinds of learnings can we actually draw from all that has been said today, especially in drawing parallels between hazard risk as well as urban inequality. And what kind of actions do we really have to privilege, especially in the different countries? I think in the case of Freetown, like Brima said, several innovative approaches have been introduced, and that is the community-based learning platform as well as the city-based learning platform. We are very much cognizant of the view that inequalities can be spatial, it can be in terms of access to resources, or it can also be in terms of the knowledge. And so therefore, in the process where knowledge seems to be a lot lacking, we think that the Sierra Leone Urban Research Center has been working with the federations to really produce this particular kind of knowledge, to see how we can lay it bare to the city authorities to be able to actually take the necessary action. But also in terms of the spatial inequality, we think that engaging communities, especially to plan their areas, to map their areas, while at the same time working with the city authorities, can kind of create a space whereby these different actors, including NGOs and the role that the CBOs are playing, as well as the private sector, to come together, to interact, to have a kind of conversation and to have a shared experience of the city. But at the same time, we also believe that, especially in terms of inadequate access to services, we think that bringing the data together with engaging the city authorities to really have a kind of reflection, because to us, we think that no one individual or no one institution has monopoly over the kinds of actions to take for developing the city, because we are all coming from different fronts, and therefore that collective engagement is very, very critical. And I think these are the kinds of solutions that we have to start thinking about as we move forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joseph. I'll now stand up because we have come to the moment of plenary discussion for about the four presentations given and the two interventions by the discussants. I would like to straight away open the floor for discussion. So if there are any questions or comments on that side, and the microphones are moving around, yes. Yes.
Good afternoon, everybody. Glenn Keeker from DePaul University in the United States, and thank you so much for the presentations. I'm curious if we can have a conversation about the tension that might exist between the notion of co-production that seemed to be a very important kind of thesis that was at play in several of the presentations, and the social construction of what risk is. And what seems to me to be important here is that we need to take the notion of disaster risk reduction and put it in the context of the post-2015 world, in which the convergence of several major global planning processes came together. It started with the Sendai Agreement on disaster risk reduction, and then it moved to the transition from the Millennium Development Goals to the Sustainable Development Goals, and then it moved to the Paris Agreement, and it culminated in the all-important Habitat 3, right, in Quito in 2016. That process needs to be the larger framework in which we think about disaster risk reduction. Who produced that knowledge? It was not co-produced. Absolutely not. The inequity and the inequality that's embedded within the production of that knowledge is defining the global agenda. To speak of co-production in that context is a farce. It is a fundamental element to the reproduction of inequity and inequality in the world. The way in which that social construction of risk happens, well, whose risk is being produced in the 2015 world? The people who produced the Paris Agreement, or the people who produced the Sendai Agreement, or the people who produced Habitat 3, right? It is fundamentally the interest of capital. If you're going to have a conversation about risk, we have to have a core understanding that the whole cultural construct of risk is embedded in the modern notion of a market economy and a capitalist market economy. That is the foundation of the cultural construction of what risk means. And it is fundamentally alien to the notion of risk that communities throughout the world have. The communities. So how do we navigate that tension between co-production, right, of knowledge as we do disaster risk reduction and try and address significant and real problems for communities? How do we navigate that with these very powerful forces, right, of global inequity and inequality that are rooted in the capitalist system, that then get articulated in these development agendas for the world? And just remember, development is nothing but the reproduction of capital.
Thank you for that wonderful view and question to the panelists. I believe that they are preparing to respond, and different skills and different perspectives that we have seen in the presentations to that very fundamental and intriguing question. And I saw another hand somewhere. Yes.
Thank you. I want to congratulate you for this wonderful presentations. My thoughts connected to this issue that was raised about capitalism and risk. What I wanted to ask you, in generally speaking, when this work began to emerge on urban risk, etc., there was also a lot of distrust of government. That government somehow, and it was that argument against government came from both the left in the form of critique of capitalism and the capitalist state, and also from the right in terms of public choice and rent-seeking theories by neoclassical economists, which essentially disregarded the notion of public interest and saying that the governmental employees, etc., are just protecting their own interest. Right? So that's why your work is so interesting, because you are showing, no, it is possible to work with government. The word co-production actually assumes there's a... So that what I want to know from you is, when you started this co-production process, tell us a little bit about the kinds of problems that you faced, and that how did you go around these problems? Because it's not that simple of co-production, because there are different powers, there are different resources, different interests. So I want you to say a little bit more about the process of co-production and what were sort of the bumps on the road, what you couldn't do or what you did well and you were surprised, and who were these people within government that worked with you that are really interested in co-production, and why? And because many times when you see these success stories, people explain it by saying, oh, it's a good mayor, or it's a very good, very charismatic leader. We cannot repeat, we cannot replicate them. We want to understand the organizational setup within which co-production works. Okay, so that's my one question. And for Alan, and I think it also, I've seen this argument before about holistic thinking, that you need a real holistic thinking to address a problem. People who have done work on actually responding to problems, they know that even if a problem can be understood in a holistic way and an integrated way, because there are many factors that create the problem, it's almost impossible to respond to it in an integrated way because of organizational constraints. And so and we make a mistake that because the problem emerges out of a set of integrated factors, the response must also be integrated. And we know enough experience that integrated efforts are very, very difficult to implement for organizational reasons. So I wanted to know more about, when you guys did your work, did you think holistically, or were you thinking where to start more strategically as to like, this is the best way to entertain?
You, Karen.
Just to follow on from Bish's comment about the co-production and the relationship between the research and government, I'm assuming that the starting point for the co-production that you're talking about, and I'm looking at the Freetown and the Dar people mainly, but also the other groups, but starting from the work that you were doing, is that the first step in that process is actually the work with communities. And that co-production just between research and the state is not what we're talking about. And that on its own, it wouldn't do the kind of things that have the impact that you're talking about. And I wonder if you can, in your discussion of co-production, talk about that relationship and how that was established in the first place alongside the other actors.
Thank you. I think we're going to give a chance to the panelists to respond to these 4 questions before we go for another round of questions again. I don't know if there's anybody who would like to give the first shot on the question about the post-2015 and the challenges of co-production of knowledge and the holistic. Alan? Brima? Alan. I'll volunteer. I'm volunteering you.
No, just one comment on. I remember when I started in this topic, I asked the question not what was a disaster or what is risk. I asked the question, what is the significance of disaster and the significance of risk, which is a completely different question. And I came to the conclusion that disaster was probably the most palpable manifestation of a breakdown of relationships between society and its environment. It was the most abrupt manifestation of that. And from there, the whole progress to trying to understand risk as a social construction, and then to integrate that with ongoing governance, which is based on historical premises and is very difficult to break. And I mention this particularly because I remember Ken Mitchell in a study, Crucibles of Hazards, a study of metropolitan areas at the end of the 80s, said that institutional systems, that is governance patterns, are always way behind the understanding of what the problem is. And that has happened with health, that has happened with mental health. So here, without going much further, I think we have a fundamental problem, and I find that this problem is identified within governments. It is not that it is an academic problem or understanding, but a lot of people in government are frustrated by the fact they know they're not in the right circle of activity, and that they have to break completely with certain patterns of behaviour in institutional organisational terms. Yeah, just to quote one, in Latin America we came out with this thing, which is now further afield than Latin America, but that's where it started, of corrective, prospective, reactive, and compensatory risk management. Very quickly, corrective is getting rid of risk that exists. So you build dikes, you put up, you sustain slopes, etc. You reforest and you rebuild hotels or retrofit them. But it's a prospective one that is the one that has to change mindsets, because prospective risk management, which is dealing with risk that isn't there, that is taking up in new investment processes for all sorts of things, is not disaster risk management. It is sustainable development management. It is many other things, but it certainly isn't disaster risk management. So with disaster risk, what we've got to do, and this is the thing I was talking with Andrew Mascry the other day, that we wrote a paper on the future of disaster risk management. I think now we need to write one on the depth of disaster risk management. Yeah, and I say that without coming to a conclusion of where we go with this. But co-production to me is part of going there. It is the capacity to generate information, debates, knowledge, which challenges status quo opinions and positions, puts communities as the basis of many things in line with government, and saying that the sectoralization, the disciplinization of things is just not going to work. What we're looking at is an integrated, holistic whole that has to be deductively divided into the adequate parts or dealt with in a completely different way. Now, it doesn't answer any questions, but this is one of the most fundamental problems for disaster risk one, because in the end, disaster risk doesn't have its own things that move it. They are in social processes in general. An urban risk is the result of urban processes, land use, land rent, environmental management, etc. So a big problem is you've got nothing to deal with as a disaster risk manager, but you do have something to deal with if you're an urban planner. And so it's very complex to get to. But risk in the end, to me, is the principal indicator of inequality. And that is transmitted through various things. And poverty can come into that in one way. And establishing the causal nexuses, I as an academic, that is my role. The role of co-production in the process is also to get it on the ground as a practice somewhere. So, I'm sorry, that was too long, but it was like...
Thank you, Aaron, for that. Just to add a little bit on Aaron's response, what I know is that the post-2015 world is also characterized by debates within the UN system about coherence. And co-production may not be the answer, as Alan says, but it could be influencing how certain things might eventually get to be done. So part of that discussion on coherence is joint indicators of UNDRR, so the Sendai, with SDGs and Paris where applicable. So that is, it may not be an influence of the co-production community, because we can agree that the co-production approach and methodology is still young and is still very much under development, but there's a little bit of influence that is coming from historical experiences and methodological approaches that is influencing that discussion. So I just wanted to add to what Alan said. There are a couple of other questions that you have to respond to. Brahima, possibly you could also bring out the response to the challenges on co-production.
Yeah, at the beginning, definitely we had what you call, there was a lack of understanding on the part of the different set of either city authorities as well as government. Basically, noting from it, traditional planning perspective, that indeed there was only recognition about just having the different set of government ministries. Basically, how best it can be able to actually join up actions was one of the key critical challenges. So mostly institutions are working in silos. How can we be able to actually break that cycle of silos, so for them to actually recognize that they need an engagement process in actually delivery on some of the key development programs within cities also. That was one critical challenge that we had. Then how mostly also the community were also recognized in terms of some of the key actions or activities that they have been doing at their own different sort of community level in actually transforming their own lives at those different levels was also another key challenge. So in essence, what we did is to be able to actually engage mostly within ministries, departments and agencies, working alongside the professionals within those sort of ministries, so that we can definitely be able to bring them on board in terms of our research and capacity building activities. So through that process, we're able to break the link between the communities as well as even the different set of government actors and institutions. When we bring them within the common platform in terms of our research and capacity building programs, they're able to actually engage, and over time, we are able to actually broker that relationship for them to see themselves as partners in development, and also be able to actually recognize each other's role in terms of what they should be able to do to address some of the key inequalities within the city itself. So, as part of our research process, we bring the different professionals bodies, as well as even the community research, as well as private sector organizations. They're all coming onto one single umbrella, and linking that one to the broader notion around the SGD, as well as even the new urban agenda and all of these things. There's a recognition that indeed translating knowledge into actions, then of course there's a need for us to be able to actually create a kind of platform. So that actually led us to developing the city as well as community learning platform, so that at least we can be able to actually create that institutional space for democratic engagement. So that at least what is happening within our community level will be brought forward. Based on generating some of the key, dynamic process of, perspective and voices together, so that they can be able to actually understand. Then there's a need for them to be able to actually, develop what's called knowledge-based solutions to some of the key critical urban developmental risk issues that are happening within those sort of area. So able to actually link the community actions into, the broader different set of agencies actors together by also building their own capacity for them to actually be able to engage and form partnership and be able to actually deliver on some concrete actions which are based on collective, intent and purpose as well.
Festo, do you have any response, especially about the entry points to holistic and integrated?
Yeah, just maybe to respond to the question about how the co-production can be just being built and the challenges being affecting over there. The realization is that it's true that in most of the government departments, they always believe that they have all the responsibility to solve all the problems. But when we did the research on the risk assessments, by engaging them, it was coming to realization that some of the issues that came up from the community, they are some of the knowledge which the government did not really realize. And as a result of that one, they have now come to realize that it's really important to engage community organizations and community groups into their own decision making. Of course, at the moment, many countries, they have a concept of the PPP, which is the private-public partnerships. And in a way, for them, they recognize that by engaging private, by engaging community, it's also becoming beneficial to them. For that, during our presentation, we cited an example that right now our community groups and our organization have been invited actually into their formal structural kind of disaster management committee. So this is the very formal kind of institutional arrangement which community groups, the federation groups have now been invited to sit upon. And we really see this as a great opportunity now to share and also be able to influence our community-driven processes, apart from the top-down kind of process. So I realize that it's a big challenge, yes, and sometimes depend very much on the individuality, on the certain officials, but when all these initiatives become being institutionalized, then whoever comes, if a new mayor comes or a new director comes, he finds that already our members have already been institutionalized into the process. So I think this is a very, very important thing that you start by individual relationship, but eventually you officiate and institutionalize that so that it becomes a formal partnerships and co-production arrangement. So this is what I wanted to respond.
And Leone, quickly.
We understand the co-production in different levels, different scales. So we are working with the communities, with the NGOs in some small level, but at the same time we are working with the government to search, to change some ideas, some paradigms the government have around the neoliberalism, the capitalism. So this work is very, very important from the university. So in the university, well, we're hosting the university, and at the same time, we can work in two senses. More like activists, so our working is very, very strongful to convince the government, especially with the Housing Ministry, and at the same time, in the academic work. So this is the reason how we are divided the problem of the inequality in a structural problem. So in this case, the work is with the government to convince to have new laws and new focus. And then in symbolic terms, or maybe in subjective terms, the academia is a very, very good place to change some paradigms, not only in the population, even in the government. So we have, because finally, functionaries in the government pass by the university, so they understand that we can talk with these people. So this work is different. So we think the university is a good place for this kind of work to integrate communities, NGOs, work with the government, and all this.
I'd just like to add to that I think it allows us to work as a bridge between macro scale planning that's sometimes very abstract and irrelevant, and also very fragmented, isolated, and atomized ongoing work within communities all throughout the metropolis. So how do you jump from that scale, the very local, to a citywide the challenge of what Alan was mentioning for a systemic response, holistic response to risk. And I think in that sense, the university and inserting these kind of discourses and questions within academic curricula is very important. And how then you also jump from the very abstract work, theoretical work of academia into a more practical approach to academia itself.